Okay, good afternoon from Norway, and whatever is the time around the world, I welcome you all in this two very profound and very well focused guest lecture today. And today is also a culminating day for our course in non-Western philosophy or global international relation course, which has just started this year. And I welcome my students who are here in the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and other students in IR from around the world. We have been teaching in this course very many different topics, starting from what is Indian contribution to IR, including what is Advait philosophy. Advait in IR, this book we have been using here, Advait as a global international relation. And then we also use in Indian philosophy, there is also a Kautilya, and then what is the relevance in IR theories. And then we have also using many other books on a Buddhist approach to international relation and so on and so forth. Also using a book written by Johan Galtung in Norwegian, Globalizing God. And then also we have been covering something on the Kyoto School of International Relations. And also in addition to that, African as well as the Sufism and also, and then in addition to these different wisdom traditions which are there in so-called non-Western world. I mean, for me, there is nothing like Eastern, Western or anything. All the knowledge is one, in fact. But of course, some people have recognized, coined this word, but now they call it global IR, global international relations, by including the thought, the concept, the philosophy, the cosmovision, the theory, also from so-called non-Western world, because now the global community is becoming a global village, and also our both happiness and suffering are shared. Climate change is a shared suffering, it's not of one individual country. Also, when war happens in one part of the world, it's affecting everywhere else around the world. And therefore, there is a need for global IR. And we have covered all these different contributions from Africa as well, Ubuntu. And also when it comes to the individual, we have already given a little more detailed lecture on the Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian contribution to IR. We talk about the Buddha and his contribution to international relation. We also talk about Ibn Khaldun from the Islamic world. And we have also talked about Nelson Mandela. And here and there in different places, we also covered, when we're talking about very many different wisdom tradition, also a little bit introductory work, particularly in relevance to environmentalism and relevance of Confucianism and also Daoism before. But today, Professor Halvor Eifring, who is a professor in University of Oslo with expertise in modern use of elements from classical Chinese language, he will be presenting his idea, his concept, his presentation on Confucianism and Daoism philosophy relevant to international relations. And Professor Halvor is engaged in syntactics, structure, and function. He is currently in charge of an international cross-disciplinary project on mind wandering in various wisdom tradition, and also contemplative practices, and also self-cultivation. Mind wandering is a problem not only for our students, for worldwide, because some of the Harvard studies that shows that 46.9% of our mind wanders. We are not here. I mean, we are listening to the lecture now, but very often, our mind wanders, goes out of this lecture hall or wherever we are sitting. So we'll hear more around that one in some future lectures and so on. But in a Chinese context, his project, Professor Halvor's project, is about Confucianism and Daoism in the classical era, as well as Buddhism in the Ming and Ying dynasties. This project also includes Indian yoga philosophy and Christian desert fathers, as well as modern neuroscience and philosophy of mind. So with this, I will not waste further time on my speech furthermore, but we'll hear from Professor Halvor. It's very honored to have you from University of Oslo. Please.
Thank you very much, Bishal. I enjoy this opportunity a lot, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And indeed, if at some point we can talk about mind wandering, that's also fine. But now, for the moment, let me share my screen. And I would just like to say before I do that, that the course, as you have just outlined, is a course that I should definitely attend myself. It's so let's see. Now you can see my screen, right?
Sure.
So this is a topic that is global, not only in the sense that it includes non-Western philosophies, but also in the sense that it covers a large time span, and in particular, the time, say, 500 to 200 BC. And when you say such things in a context where the topic is international relations, one may also want to ask, what can we learn from this kind of history? What is the relevance of history at all to our present day concerns? There are several possible answers to that question. One answer is to look at how in present day China, which is, after all, a country that has quite an important role in the current society. The leader of the country, the president, Xi Jinping, uses and often, as I say, misuses aspects of Chinese history to build his view of China in the world today. For instance, by referring to China as a Confucian society, which is partly, of course, correct, but which also is problematic in many senses, as we will return to. There are Confucian elements in modern China. There are also very many other elements that are usually disregarded in this respect. And to a large extent, philosophy is used in this context to sort of bolster one particular view of how China should be seen in the world. It's also history being sort of a part of modern, any kind of modern Chinese identity. Again, you can talk about Confucian culture, but what many people refer to as Confucian culture very often has very little to do with actual Confucianism, at least the way it was formulated in the time period I talked about. So going back to history also teaches us to see through some of the ways that such concepts are being used and misused. Furthermore, history can sometimes, I mean, what can we learn from history? Sometimes history can provide parallels to modern problems, modern issues, modern conundrums. And indicate some kinds of solutions. For instance, the legalist, non-Confucian, non-Daoist, but legalist philosopher Han Fei talked in a very modern terms. I mean, more than 200 years BC, he talked in very modern terms about taxing the rich to help the poor, which was evidently an issue in societies of that period. He thought it was a bad idea because if the rich were rich because they had been diligent, and the poor were poor because they had been lazy, of course we know that's not always the case, but in his way of reasoning, that would amount to rewarding the lazy and punishing the diligent. So in that sense, yeah, and this is a kind of problematics that of course is still very much alive today in the discussion of social welfare, social issues. Not that we want to assume Han Fei's solution, but still it is a relevant issue all throughout history. Then there is one disturbing fact that we will return to also later in this lecture, which is the fact that neither Confucianism nor Daoism, if you say that Confucianism was concerned with morality and Daoism with spirituality, none of them led to what the sort of final unification of China, of the Chinese cultural area. A rather more ruthless, but also very well argued for solution with the legalism that we just talked about with Han Fei, was in fact the ideology that, or philosophy that won out in 221 BC. So is ruthlessness really then superior to morality and spirituality? Is also a question we must come back to. One final thing about history, which I think is also important, is the fact that we have gotten used to, especially in the modern age where communication is so comparably easy, we have gotten used to sort of one way of being a human being or being a human society as being sort of the standard, and very easily look away from alternatives. While history can show us that there are many ways of being human, many ways of being a society that differ from present day models. And in our case, since we're talking about international relations, we will have to talk about international relations in a society without nations. I mean, if we talk about China sort of before China was unified, we are talking about relations between different political entities, but they can't really be seen as nations. So it's international in a very special sense. So that's some of the things about learning from history. By the way, when I begin to speak like this, I will go on and on and on. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to raise a hand and to then ask a question or provide a comment or whatever. So don't be shy about that. Then how can ancient philosophy, Chinese philosophy in this case, be relevant to international relations? We know that in the case of Chinese philosophy, the two sort of dominant philosophies that we have referred to in the title of this talk, Confucianism and Daoism, they were both in different ways concerned with individual self-cultivation. The individual and how he or she, mostly and unfortunately he in the texts, was supposed to be either cultivating himself in order to become a moral person, or cultivating himself in order to raise one's own level of spirituality. Now, how can this be relevant to international relations at all? Well, first of all, most ancient Chinese philosophers saw themselves as advisors to rulers. They even often went from state to state in what was then a conglomerate of smaller and bigger states in what is today the Chinese area. They were trying all the time to give advice to these rulers, even when they talked about self-cultivation. Then, let's see, oops, sorry. Also, and that's important, more important than it may sound, most ancient Chinese philosophers lamented the state of a society split into individual states. And in one sense, you may say that almost all of early Chinese philosophy is a reaction towards a state of affairs where society is split into individual states and which was seen as a situation that needed to be remedied in some way. Okay, let's then first go into this self-cultivation part and see what briefly what lies in that aspect of early Chinese philosophy. And let's start with Confucianism, which then is concerned with moral self-cultivation primarily, aimed at realizing specific moral virtues or values. As in this sort of autobiographical little snippets from Confucius himself, saying that when I was 15, I was bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I was free from confusion. At 50, I knew heaven's decree, what heaven wanted with me. At 60, my ear was receptive. And at 70, I could follow my heart's desires without transgressing. Not bad. I don't know what all of these things actually stand for, but at least they point to a kind of development of a kind of moral person where at the end, at 70, sort of morality comes spontaneously. He can follow his heart's desires without transgressing. Now, some of these, or some of the main sort of moral virtues referred to in this context were benevolence, yen, righteousness, yi, ritual propriety. Rites were extremely important in that society. Ritual propriety, li, and wisdom, zhi. So these were some of the sort of basic moral virtues that one sought to develop within the Confucian framework. Now, on the other side of the philosophical spectrum, Daoism was much less concerned with morality, and sometimes even looked down upon morality, and was more concerned with spiritual self-cultivation, and aimed at realizing the way. The way is what is in Chinese called the Dao, which often in Western context is written T-A-O because of a different transcription system. So Tao and Dao are the same. Daoism is Taoism. There is no difference. It's just different ways of writing the same thing. And this way, or Dao, is a dimension that goes beyond the senses, beyond thoughts, beyond feelings, beyond language, beyond everything, beyond all phenomena we see around us, and even all phenomena in our inner minds, something that sort of lies, as it says, in a different dimension. That is a very central thing to Daoism. You have in the Lao Tzu, the perhaps earliest Taoist philosophical work, starts with a very famous dictum that if the way can be spoken of, it is not the constant way. And another text, perhaps slightly later, picks up on that and says, the way is what the mouth cannot speak of, the eyes cannot see, the ears cannot hear. So there is something in existence that goes beyond the sort of concrete world around us that needs to be realized through meditation, through other exercises, etc. And these are some of the various qualities that are promoted within Taoism as being closer to this Tao. Essence is Jing in Chinese, something essential. Energy, very well known also in Western societies as Qi, Qi or sometimes Chi. Then spirit, Shen, and power, meaning some kind of inner power, De, which are all sort of things that within Taoism one seeks to cultivate. Okay, but all this, what does it have to do with international relations? Well, the fact is that all of this philosophizing can be seen as a kind of reaction to something that happened in China half a millennium earlier, when what used to be called the Shang people or the Shang areas were occupied by the Zhou, which was another tribe. So the Shang tribe and the Zhou tribe, both of them were apparently what we today might call Chinese speaking and even Chinese writing tribes, but identify themselves as different. And in somewhere around 1045 BC, Zhou conquers Shang and includes some of the Shang rulers as part of their area, but still makes a different society. And what is important in our case, also regarding international relations, is that this implied a kind of change from a tribal society where different tribes sometimes were at war, sometimes were at peace with each other, with their areas perhaps not entirely fixed, to a feudal society in which there was one center or central state with the Zhou king in charge, who was then seen as ruling the entire area by heaven's decree. Heaven is the ultimate deity in this context, a god. And the Zhou king was the ruler, but there were also all these other feudal states around his central state. And these feudal states were very often then ruled by family or kins of the Zhou king, so that there was a kind of network building on family relations primarily that were given these areas to govern. And this became then the Zhou dynasty, where the Zhou king then sort of was hereditarily replaced by a new Zhou king when he died, etc. But the relations, the primary relations within this area were between feudal states that were all subordinate to the Zhou state in the middle. Of course, this, although they sometimes speak as if this covered the entire world, they knew, of course, that there were other peoples around them, but they did not speak Chinese usually. They certainly didn't write, neither Chinese nor anything else. And they didn't have the same value systems as the Chinese. Hence, they were regarded as barbarians. Barbarians in one sense or the other. They were different. They were others. They were not sort of the cultivated, civilized people of the Chinese areas. That was another kind of international relation, if you like, in this period, which then was built on the fact that they didn't really count. The only thing that could happen to them that would be good was that they were Sinicized, that they, which sometimes happened, that they were either invaded or for other reasons then adapted Chinese civilization and values. Okay, so this was the establishment of the Zhou feudal state, which then was one type of international relations between these different feudal states. Now, if we go further some 100 years, the spring and autumn period is a period that lasts from 771 BC to 400 and something, 450 perhaps BC. In this period, perhaps towards the end of this period, we begin to get the first Chinese philosophers. Confucius was definitely in this period, located in this period, perhaps also Lao Tzu. So there are many controversies surrounding Lao Tzu, whether he lived at this time, at a later time, or even much later, or even that he didn't exist at all. That Lao Tzu just means the old master or the old masters, and there was no such person. So we don't really know, but it seems to me not unreasonable, at least, to believe that the text referred to as written by Lao Tzu is around the same period. So this period, and what was important about this period was that these feudal states that we just talked about were beginning to become independent, much more independent, in the sense that they were the familial relations that had kept the sort of Zhou dynasty together. They were gradually over the centuries being much thinner, becoming much thinner. So, I mean, if 1000 BC, I gave this piece of earth or piece of land to my brother or my son or my nephew or whatever, if we go further down in time, the familial relations will be much, much, much thinner, so that they actually behave much more like independent states and do no longer heed whatever the Zhou state or the Zhou king tells them to. They act on their own, though at least in this period they still pay lip service to the Zhou king. They still sort of, on the surface, in words, they still consider themselves as subordinates to the Zhou king, and only the Zhou king can call himself king. The others are not kings, but well, you can gong. You can translate that in different ways. At least they're not kings. Now, in this period, of course, many of these states are also at war with each other, although they sort of nominally belong to the same larger Zhou area, but they still are at war with each other. And there is a considerable amount of diplomacy going on between these states. So these states, between these states, you get much, something that comes much closer to modern day international relations than what we saw at the beginning of this feudal period. Now, this change of affairs was very much perceived as moral and spiritual decay, very much lamented, and that was part of the basis for both Confucian and Taoist philosophy. Both Confucius and Lao Tzu, if the latter actually did exist, professed to give advice to the rulers of states, sometimes in order to, so that Confucius said that moral values must return to the ways of the early Zhou kings. That's the way you can rule your country. I follow Zhou, he says explicitly. Whereas Lao Tzu says something along he says that spiritual self-cultivation will make you an ideal ruler. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, this work, it is said that the sage says, I take no action. No action is a very central sort of value in this, sort of not to be overly excessive in interfering and acting. I take no action, he says, and the people are transformed of themselves. I prefer stillness, and the people are rectified of themselves. I am not meddlesome, and the people prosper of themselves. I am free from desire, and the people of themselves return to simplicity. That's Taoist, the Taoist view, or at least one Taoist view of how the ideal ruler, the sage ruler, can act, or rather not act, in order to make his state thrive. And the underlying assumption is often, both in Confucianism and in Taoism, that if a state thrives, whether on moral grounds or on spiritual grounds, other people in other states will want to belong to that state, meaning that they will gradually then be able to expand their territory and win over the other states. Okay. Now, next, we come into a later area, starting shortly after the death of Confucius. Confucius died in 479 BC, we think, and the area, the time period that we now enter into is the Warring States period, and the name of that period tells us everything. This was, I mean, now these independent states were openly fighting for hegemony. They no longer considered Zhou their superior, and they tried the best they could. Some of them had better conditions than others to inflict a hegemony on the entire Chinese civilizational area. And if we see this, that this is at the beginning of the period where we see a number of different states, some of them named, some of them not named, and the things went back and forth, so that just a couple of years later, you see that part of it is the Jin state is almost eradicated, and we have new states, Zhao and Wei, coming up. And then if we go almost 90 years later, things are beginning to change again, though fairly stable in this period. Though you see that the Chu state is expanding to its south, to the south. And you go further, just 11 years later, and things, you say that Qin, the red one here, is beginning to expand to the west. Well, that's important. Chu is also expanding. You go to the 279 BC, and what do you see? Qin is becoming enormous. Qin is really expanding and eating up other states as it goes along. And this goes on. Oh, this was also 279, sorry. And just 2 years later, new ways of seeing it. And then Qin begins to grow even more, 260, even larger. And one important thing that has happened as we went along here is that by 249, the Zhou state, which we remember was the superior state, the king state, which was formerly the superior of all the others, where the king was, now it no longer exists. That happened somewhere in the 250s BC. And then in 230, well, still much Qin expansion. It eats up some of the neighboring states' territory. Chu is also large still. And then 223, there are only four or five different competitors left. 223 BC. You have Qin, you have Chu, you have Zhao and Yan and Qi. And these states are then fighting for hegemony. And in this period, during this warring states period where war was rampant, this is the period where Chinese philosophy comes into existence. I mean, all what they call all the masters and the 100 schools beyond Confucius himself and Lao Tzu come in this period. Confucian philosophers, you have Mencius, Xunzi, these two persons, and both of them continue then the tradition of providing advice to rulers. On the Taoist side, you have the very prominent Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi, who then partly breaks with this tradition of providing advice to rulers and turns his back on politics in favor of individual spirituality. But still, even his work has a lot that is politically relevant. And then the eventual result, Qin eats up all the other states. From 223, which was the last thing we saw here, at the bottom right place, where there were still 5 different states, to just 2 years later, Qin rules the entire area. And in effect, establishes what becomes then the Chinese Empire. And this is also of philosophical interest, because the Qin rulers eventually did not listen to the Confucian advisors. They did not listen primarily to their Taoist advisors. They listened to another philosophical school called the Legalists, with these names that we see here: Shen Buhai, Shang Yang, and Han Fei. And Han Fei is the most famous one today, because he also wrote very well. He didn't speak very well, but he wrote very well. Incidentally, 2 of these, both Shang Yang and Han Fei, died more or less at the hands of their rulers. So they were not really rewarded themselves for their contribution to the expansion of Qin. But there is no doubt that Shang Yang was the one who set in motion the extreme expansion of the Qin state, and that Han Fei continued this and was very much responsible for the fact that Qin the Qin state was able to eat up all these other states and eventually then unifying the Chinese empire. This is, of course, philosophically important because it means that centralized power and, as I said initially, ruthlessness wins over morality and spirituality, which were more Confucian and and the Daoist concerns. You can say that realpolitik becomes more important than lofty ideals of morality or lofty ideals of a spiritual dimension. It's easy to paint legalism in a negative light because of this, but legalism is also a very effective administrative philosophy which relies more on your merits. Perhaps later in Chinese history, you get the exam system, which saw to it that people with no particularly good background in terms of family could enter into government service, that meritocracy becomes more important than nobility, family relations. There was also, at least in theory, in legalism, an idea about equality before the law. In reality, that may have been different, but one of the reasons why Shangyang may have been punished by his ruler was that he tried to punish one of the ruler's relatives because he was following the law. The idea of rewards and punishment is very central to legalist theory, that good actions should be rewarded, bad actions should be punished. It was also a philosophy which led the first Qin emperor, or the first Qin emperor, to burn all other books than the ones that were sort of accepted by his state, and also, according to some later accounts, to bury scholars of Confucian, Taoist, or other beliefs. And in a way, you can say this is also a tradition that has continued in China. The map on the lower right side here tells us something about the actual international context of the Qin Empire, but it tells us very little about actual international relations, apart from the so-called barbarians right around the Qin Empire. The rest here were not in direct contact with the Qin Empire at all, as far as we can see. The Qin Empire did not last long. It sort of became an empire in 221 BC, and by 206 it was wiped away, and what eventually then came instead was what is known as the Han Dynasty, lasting 400 years, more than 400 years, with a slight pause in the middle. And the Han Dynasty is not very important in our case. It continues, of course, the Chinese empire, and also expands the empire to the west, as we see some of the arrows here, to the west and to the north, also to the south to some extent, into northern Vietnam. What is important in our philosophical context is that the Han Dynasty sort of reacted against legalism, the legalist philosophy that had helped the Qin to win over all the other states, and established then what has since been called the Confucian state, which is still today sort of largely how Chinese see themselves, as Chinese rulers, including Xi Jinping, sees the state of affairs in China. And in the Han Dynasty, early in the Han Dynasty, legalist works were even outlawed. That doesn't mean that legalism had no impact. Most of the legalist reforms we just talked of still continued to exist, and many of them even to this day. And it's something that is often discussed, that even today, although China is considered to be a Chinese or Confucian state, actually the impact of legalism on today's affairs is just as big. So that's sort of the historical background for all we have been through here, also philosophically speaking. Now, Confucianism and Daoism and legalism, all these three philosophies have things in common. And they, to some extent, also influence each other. And one of the concepts that they do seem to have in common is the idea of non-action, which is actually also one of the places where at least Taoist philosophy resembles some early Indian philosophy in the Bhagavad Gita, where the best way of acting is to not act excessively, to not interfere, to not try too hard. As one author put it, trying not to try. To sort of develop a way of acting that did not, was not excessive in this sense. This is an idea that goes through Confucianism, from Confucius through Mencius to Xunzi. In Daoism, Lao Tzu, and is most often associated with Daoism, from Lao Tzu to Zhuangzi, and where it also in the Lao Tzu has clear political impact. If you practice non-action, order will prevail in the country. That's more or less the implication here. And also in legalist contexts, where Shen Bohai, and you see Han Fei, that we have heard about, saying that if the enlightened ruler above governs through non-action, the ministers below fulfill their duties with reverence and fear. So the ruler above should sort of stay back a bit. The ruler above should not be too concerned with sort of meddling in everybody's business, is the idea here. This idea has also been taken up in by some modern Chinese theorists or philosophers, and been used as a kind of argument for a free economy, for instance. So the ideas are still alive. You can say that Chinese philosophy in this period that we're talking about, it's going through a development. If we look at the oldest exemplars from around 500 BC, Confucius and Lao Tzu, they simply state their ideas. They don't argue for them, they just state them. And around them are disciples that say, yes, 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 all the time. You have that feeling. There are no real arguments, just statements. Then a couple of 100 years later, with Mencius, you get a lot of arguments, but arguing by analogy, taking, for instance, the way if you pull at sprouts in the field to make them grow, this will make the sprouts not grow, but simply die. And using that as an analogy for being too eager, having too much action in your everyday life or in the running of the country or the state. Or on the other hand, you have Zhuangzi, which in some respects is very much concerned with logics and logical arguments, but is much more dominated by anecdotal arguments, anecdotes about a bird flying in from the north, a fish spreading out all over the place, and then using those things to present his own philosophy. Until you get to the end of the Warring States period in the late 3rd century BC, where Xunzi, the Confucian Xunzi, and the legalist Han Fei are much sort of write essays that are intellectually reasoning. They reason their way to their conclusions. So there is a development of the form of Chinese philosophy in this period. There is also a development in the sense that in Confucius, benevolence, Ren, is the highest ideal. It's not always clear what Ren means, what benevolence in this context means, and Confucius gives himself lots of different definitions. But it is a slightly difficult term to get at, but it's clearly what Confucius sets the highest. Then 200 years later with Mencius, he is also concerned with benevolence, but is much more concerned with righteousness, this other Confucian moral value. And righteousness is much more easy to talk about. It has to do with whether things are fair or not. It has to do with treating everybody fairly, etc. So it's easier to pinpoint than benevolence. With Xunzi, you get ritual propriety. Rites are much more, even more easy to pinpoint because they have to do with actual actions. And then when you jump over to Han Fei, who was actually a student of Xunzi, law becomes the central value. Law, and which is sort of put down, written down in a way that is accessible to everybody. And that's the standard to go by. I think we will go over this. We will have 1 minute at least for questions at the end. So I'll just conclude this session that what have we been through in this period? Well, we have seen that the development from a tribal to a feudal society when the Zhou took over from the Shang in more than 1,000 years BC was sort of something that instigated a huge difference in the way international relations were built. And this continued and changed very much in the whole Zhou period, where the feudal states gradually became more and more independent, and then at the end became, at the end for 200 years became warring states, and that this period, however bad it must have been to be part of the warring states period, it was a very, very fruitful period for the development, rise of Chinese philosophy, for Confucian morality, for Daoist spirituality, and also for the ideas of legalist realpolitik. All of this really came up and to the forefront through these kinds of wars between the states. And then ending with the warring states, with one of the warring states sort of winning over the others, and then creating a unified empire with the Qin, where the victory of legalism took place. And then after the Qin, the Han dynasty, where you got legalist policies in Confucian garb. And that's to a large extent where we are still today in Chinese society. One type of international relations that we haven't touched much upon, we have mentioned it, is the relation between the Chinese areas and Chinese states on the one hand, and the so-called barbarian cultures and tribes and states on the other hand. That's another chapter. So I think we'll talk so far about this, and if there are any last-minute questions or comments, I very much welcome them. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Halvor. You can turn off your screen.
Yes.
Yes, I think we all are very much enlightened with this lecture, and there are very many new information for me also. Today I learned quite a lot. And in terms of international relation, this Confucius emphasized the importance of respect, morality, and social order in relationship between the nation. And all this, along the line, this philosophy also believed that rulers should be led by example and set moral standard for their subject, and good government is essential for social stability and peace. And also Confucius' idea on importance of moral leadership, which is lacking in this world today, and also mutual respect in international relations, have been studied and applied in various ways throughout the history as an idea, as a concept, as in philosophy, but I don't know in the practice and so on. But whatever it is, China have been promoting Confucius idea globally in a number of ways, like Confucius Institute. When you look at the net today, there are almost 6,000 Confucius Institute has been established around the world in a mostly non-profit way. And China is also using Confucius as a symbol of its cultural heritage, and also is a means of cultural diplomacy. And they are organizing very many different exhibitions and showcase. In Nepal, there are few Confucius Institute already. And also China has introduced Confucius idea in its education more profoundly than ever before, and also in the media and making film and so on. So meaning that they are globalizing. I mean, the economic power is one thing, but to live as a dignified way as a nation which have a rich wisdom tradition and also heritage and a civilization which international community need to listen and pay attention to. They are doing everything today. So Professor Halvor, thank you so much for your lecture and presentation. And I trust that you may be available for us in future.
Thank you very much.
I understand that I don't see anything I think they have to do in the chat now, because when we are talking and when students are coming in, we have to turn off the recording. But all in all, I thoroughly enjoyed your lecture.